Hey again, woodworkers. Okay, so I'm back from the drill press and I'm trying to set up for cutting out the rest of this mortise. So I have my chisels, those all set up. They're recently sharpened, which is always important. Should go without saying. The other thing that I have is I've set up a little bench hook on my bench here, and this is a good way of supporting this material so that you're not potentially damaging or chopping into your bench. Now my bench is past the point of salvation here. It's pretty well used, but I think this is a good way to get into really making some damage onto what is a disposable part of your hand tool arsenal. So I have this, but on a longer board like this one, you're going to find this tipping problem. So having a board that's the same thickness as your bench hook, I can extend this over, and that will support this material safely. It's important that the accessory piece is not thicker or thinner than this piece, because it's going to start to affect my understanding of what perpendicular here is, and I need to make sure that I have a good sense of that when it is I'm chopping. Alright, so now that I have that getting into my mortise, refocusing. So chisel selection. So I have chisels that are just a little bit too big for my mortise, and ones that are too small, and then I have one that's kind of right on the money, assuming I have a mortise that's a ½ inch, which is what my chisel that's a ½ inch that my mortise is also. I actually don't want to use the exact size for chopping out my mortises, and I know that's somewhat counter to what a lot of woodworkers would do. I want to use something a little bit smaller, just in case my chisel goes a little bit out of control or haphazard. I start chopping out a mortise that's larger than I want, whereas a smaller chisel, I can really get in and fine-tune this thing. Alright, so the next question is, where do I start when I start chopping out this mortise? And if considering what this tool is, we in essence have a really sharp wedge, basically this shape of the flat back and then the angled bevel here. This starts to create a situation that if there's any force on the bevel side here, so if I'm chopping down in the middle of having wood on both sides, that force is going to push back on that wedge, and you're going to start to drive this chisel further and further and further back from where it is you want this to chop. So, keeping that in mind, I need to shear off or cut very small amounts of material, as much as I can, and kind of pare back until I get to my line. The other thing about the force of this chisel with this wedge is that if I were to start with cutting parallel to the long grain, when I get to the ends of this material, that wedge shape, depending on how much I'm paring away, that wedge can start to transfer or carry that through, and can start to split this wood a little bit, and so it starts to give you some trouble with making a nice clean cut where you need it. So because of all that, I like starting on the ends of the board, and you can see here I'm just getting a little bit of material from where the drill press has made that round hole. So I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/8 of an inch away, and I'm going to keep working my way back. And I know my hand is blocking this a little bit. And I'm using a mallet. I would encourage everybody to do that for longevity of the tool, or of your body, actually. A lot of people use a hand to start to drive this thing in, but there's a lot of really sensitive stuff in here that, depending on where you start to strike this chisel, it can start to affect you really negatively, and carpal tunnel is kind of a big thing that we don't want to aggravate. So anyway, a mallet keeps a woodworker happy and healthy and safe. Okay, just reiterating that now I've taken little steps here and working back to my line. Now, since I'm on my line, this is a critical piece for making sure that I've got an accurate cut. So with this chisel in place, I'm right on my line here. You'll notice that I took successive steps back to that line. I didn't start with chopping on that line because I knew that that force would be pushing back past my line. So kind of inching up on it, and then that last cut is really critical. And a lot of this has to do with the position of this chisel for the alignment of cutting a nice perpendicular line. If I were to cut the same location but facing the front of the chisel, I start to lose a sense of vertical. And so because of that, I prefer to cut when I can always sight down the back of this chisel. That gives me the best sense of when I'm cutting perpendicular or not. So that looks like a good place to end. The thing that you should also notice is when I'm cutting this, I'm not going all the way through the board. If I were to go through the full thickness of this board, I'm guaranteed to get a lot of tear out on the bottom or blowout. A good rule of thumb to remember here is anytime the tool leaves the surface of the wood, so if I'm coming out and it's leaving the bottom of this face, that's where tear out could happen or will happen. So because of that, I'm going halfway down roughly, and then I'm going to flip this around. You'll notice that I haven't removed any of the material here, and then I will start to match that first cut from that other face. Finding my line. Now I can feel that this cut has connected with that other cut on the opposite face, so I don't want to continue the same amount of force down because I know I can start to tear this thing out. Even with no material there, any variance as far as the geometry here can start to set this thing up. So, good. Alright, so connecting those two, I'm going to do the same on the opposite end quickly. I think in this location you can see the benefit of not having a chisel that's the exact dimension of your mortise. If I'm just inside of that mortise, I have the option of cutting out the material that's left on both of those edges, which is what I want. A lot of people talk about where to hold the chisel. I really prefer keeping my hand, my left hand, my non-dominant hand, anchored onto the material. So you kind of see that I have the edge of my hand here resting, and then with my fingers I can start to align, reset this where it needs to go, and also functions as a bit of a shock absorber when I start striking, because I can start to steer and guide this a little bit through the cut. If I'm holding too far up on the handle, I just feel like I'm losing a lot of that control. It's probably okay for carpentry if you're looking to do a lot of rapid material removal, but for this really fine work, you have to be kind of gingerly about how you approach these things. Alright, sneaking up to my line, and I've got about a 32nd of an inch or so of material remaining, and that's a good place to end. Okay, so in my cut here, it's really important that when I remove this chisel, I want to move it laterally, so side to side, free it, and then pull this thing back out. If I were to have this chisel in place and then start leveraging it front to back, there's so much force on that tip that you're going to start to actually tear out a chunk of this, or at least fold or round over that sharp edge that you've worked so hard to create. So be cautious of that. I want to clear out all the chips that might have freed up from this process. Anything that's underneath the bench, like if I had this piece between my work surface and then the bench hook, as I drive force down here, this is going to bruise the face of the board. So it's always important to make sure these are clear as you cut. Alright, now that I have most of the material out on the ends, I'm going to sneak in on the edges. Switch to a larger chisel because I've got a longer area. And you could probably see and also hear that this is a much more gentle cut than I'm making because I'm cutting with the grain. And you think about the fibers of that grain, in essence you're just trying to separate those things. Or from here, if I were to wedge my chisel here, I'm separating out the parts that are remaining and the parts that I want to remove. And same rules apply. I'm going to inch up towards my layout line until I have about a 32nd of an inch or less, and get in there. I know I already mentioned this in this video, but the importance of sharpness, it's so important for two reasons. Number one, it's much safer to use a chisel that's sharp. One that's dull, you have to exert so much force to actually have that thing sever fibers or at least separate the material. And so with a sharp chisel, you get such a easier cut. It really does most of the work for you, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's very much true. It's just a much more enjoyable practice. And then the obvious other piece is just the quality of the cut that you're going to get is so superior to anything that you would ever get with a dull chisel. Okay. Alright, so I roughed out these pieces on the edges. You can start to see this taking shape. So I've got a good looking perimeter here. I just need to flip this around and connect those points. When thinking about cutting the ends, which is where we started with, it's still important, arguably, to make sure that your chisel is perpendicular to this face, but you could undercut that surface area a little bit, so undercutting from both faces, creating a negative spot, and that's okay. These areas here, the long grain, these are so critical for making sure that that is a nice straight line, because that is going to function as our glue surface when the tenon is in place. And if I were to undercut in these areas, then I compromise the integrity of that joint, and long term there's just not enough glue to hold this into place when you have things like trauma, when you drag, let's say we're making a table, dragging that table around, or shipping, or even just delivering it from your studio to your client. I know you can't see what I'm doing here because my hand is in the way, but just take some very small paring cuts. And I don't want to force this through, but I can see that I'm almost there. Alright, I'll try to move my hand a little bit. Almost done here. So in that point, the tone starts to change. I could tell that I'm cutting material from the other face, so I'm getting close to that midway point or breaching that midway. So I want to slow down a little bit and not force this through. It's very easy to flip this around and connect those two lines. The other thing I should mention is that in this process of cutting the edges, bear with me, sorry. in the process of cutting these edges, as I was doing, if you have real dramatic grain in these areas, you can start cutting from this standpoint. I'm cutting further away from myself towards where I'm at, and that's okay, but the grain sometimes is going to dictate that you might have to chop the other direction. If I had a real strong grain that was doing something similar to this, so I'd have more cathedrals possibly. If I were to start cutting here, I would start having those fibers that are fused together. Those could start to split into or past where your layout line is. So at that point I would have to chop from here down. So just make sure to be sensitive to read the material, and you can't really force it. If it wants to work, it will. If it gives you some response to saying, yep, this is going to give you trouble, then heed that advice and back away. Right. So now I'm going to go back in where I started, because I'm into the interior of this cut, and basically clean up those corners. Alright, so while I'm doing this, I can hear all of your comments, if you've made it this far in the video, about, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work. Why not just use a fill in the blank for a machine that proposes to do the same work? I think most obviously would be a hollow chisel mortiser to do this, and that's valid. You can definitely use those in a lot of circumstances. A lot of the decision is going to be based on the quality of the cut, the size of the mortise, and if it has parallel edges. So because this is a relatively narrow board, I could probably mount this into a hollow chisel mortiser, should you have one, and then I can cut out this mortise. If I have to cut a mortise that does not fall within an empirical or a metric bit size, then that suits your needs, then I can't use any of those, and I have to use hand tools for doing it. And then as well, if I have something that is not parallel to these edges, it starts to get a little bit tricky for clamping those in. Some of those machines have an articulating fence that will allow you to cut things that are not parallel to this edge, which is great. But we get back into the quality of cut for what we're getting. And I'm starting with a pretty steep angle here just to cut off the interior here. It's come to a bit of a peak, and it's too much material for me to just chop straight down, so I have to just cut away the outside edge and the interior of this mortise, and then a little bit less angle, a little bit less, and a little bit less. Then I can start squaring this thing up. And then the last thing for those tools, the hollow chisel mortiser, is that if I had a piece that did not have parallel faces, so if I had a board that had a curve or an angle, those things start to create challenges for the nature of how those things work. So there's some limitations. There are enough so that learning and understanding how to properly cut mortises by hand is so important, and doing it well is the first step in making work that will last. But the enjoyment of doing this is pretty fantastic. The accuracy of doing this far outweighs what you can get from a machine. Certainly the hollow chisel mortiser, and yeah, and on and on. It really is kind of a different operation